We're trying to figure out what is this bracha talking about, and when is it written? Is it written in a time in which there is avodah? That's the name of the bracha. Written in a time when there is sacrifice, or is it written in a time when there isn't sacrifice? And if we're living in that time, then what are we actually asking for in a bracha that's called avodah? So we're going to get to look a little bit further into at least the rabbinic texts and their understanding of what is the origin of this bracha. To help just orient us to this, and to, I would say, the surprising version that we actually recite, which is very different than perhaps how this originally appeared in our sources. So I'm going to share the screen so we can jump into this together. This is an unusual bracha because we actually have some examples of where it showed up, at least according to the Mishnah, and how it was a little bit different from the Amidah. In other words, it seems to be a standalone blessing that gets grafted onto the Amidah when that ends up getting formed. That's a whole other debate, is how old is the Amidah. But let's just take a look at how it's a standalone bracha in other contexts. So one Mishnah is in Masechet Tamid, which is talking about the daily sacrifice, which our tefillot, which our Amidot are modeled after. And after the sacrifice is performed, then we have the following liturgy that is recited. The appointed one, meaning the appointed priest, says to them, bless one blessing. They blessed, read the 10 commandments, Shema, V'hayim Shamoa, and Bayomer, the 3 paragraphs of Shema, as we know them. And then, Baruch Hu et ha'am shalosh brachot. Then probably they blessed the nation 3 blessings, which are Emet v'Yatziv, V'Avodah, Ubirkot Kohanim. So the 3 blessings that are recited after Shema, one of them is familiar to us, Emet v'Yatziv. That's the beginning of the bracha that we say after Shema, at least in the morning. That's how it starts, which ends Ga'al Yisrael. Then we have something called Avodah, the service, the worship. And then we have Birkat Kohanim, which is, as we'll see in a couple of weeks, sort of the trigger for Sim Shalom. So this is not an Amidah, but it is a sort of liturgical moment when something, a blessing called Avodah, appears, and it happens after the blessing, after the performance of the daily sacrifice. So the Mishnah doesn't spell out what Avodah is, like what the text of this bracha is, but just so you can see the locus of the bracha, it is a bracha that is said after the performance of a sacrifice. In addition to some of the other liturgy, which we may be familiar with, which we don't associate with sacrifice, like Shema, and some which we don't recite anymore on a daily basis, like 10 Commandments. These are other stories, but just our bracha is showing up after the performance of the daily sacrifice. Rashi's going to explain to us what Avodah is, and he says, Bishvil Avodah she'asu, based on the worship, the cultic service that they just performed, i.e. the daily sacrifice, they would bless after that sacrifice, and then he gives us the text. Ritzeh Adonai Eloheinu Avodat Amcha Yisrael. Accept Adonai our God, the service of your people Israel. And notice what's missing in that line is Ritzeh Adonai Eloheinu Amcha Yisrael Ubi Tfilatam. The tefillah is sort of delayed a little bit. Then he says the next line of the bracha that they used to say in the temple, according to Rashi, was V'ishei Yisrael, the fires of Israel. Makes sense because we're talking about the sacrifice. Utfilatam tikabel baratzon, and their prayers. Now this might be, again, all this is Rashi's retrojection. We don't actually have any text like this exactly the way he's saying it, but this is what he imagines, a version of our bracha that is focused more on sacrifice than on tefillah, but tefillah is there nevertheless. And then he gives us the end of the bracha, which we say is, Machazir Shekhinah Tol Tzion, may God's presence return to Zion. But that doesn't make sense to say that bracha if you're actually in Zion and you're sacrificing before God who's present. So instead, you would end the bracha, Baruch HaMikabel Avodat Amo Yisrael Biratzon. Blessed be God who receives the service of his people Israel with will, or with acceptance, with rotzeh, with wanting, with desire. Or he gives another option, she'odcha levarcha b'yirah na'avod, that you alone we worship, which we saw as an ending that appears in the Eretz Yisrael version. So what you're seeing here is Rashi's giving a little bit of context for why does the bracha at the end of our blessing focus on God returning to Zion. That's a substitute for an original blessing that was about focusing not on God's return to Zion, God's in Zion, but rather focusing on God accepting our worship, our sacrifice, or by us sort of doubling down on the fact that we are worshiping, the avod, that we are worshiping, but through sacrifice, we're worshiping only God. So that's, if you were going to sort of take the rabbinic view of the history of this bracha, this is one take on it, which is it was a blessing that was said in the temple times, that was liturgically overlapping, but not the same as the bracha that we have ourselves. And the word ritzeh, which is a word that's used with sacrifice, makes a lot of sense as the opening of a bracha that you use to accept sacrifice. Let's see how this plays out a little bit further. We have another example in the in another place in the Mishnah talking about the high priest. When the high priest would perform the sacrifices on Yom Kippur, at the very end of that, there were 8 brachot that the high priest would say, including one called Al HaAvodah, on the sacrifice, on the worship. And we're not going to go into the list of all 8, but if you take a look of the Talmud is trying to understand what Avodah is, and we have in the Yerushalmi, in the Jerusalem Talmud, so we have Al Avodah. What is the blessing Al Avodah that the high priest would say on Yom Kippur? She'odcha nira v'na'avod, that we will fear and we will serve, we will worship, we will perform sacrifices for. Avodah na'avod. So again, this is another context in which our bracha makes an appearance, not connected to the Amidah per se, but as the bracha that you recite after the performance of a sacrifice. And again, that's the name of our bracha. Now we see other witnesses to older texts of our bracha in rabbinic literature. Another one shows up in Vayikra Rabbah, the old midrash on Leviticus, and the midrash reads as follows: Our rabbi said, "How do we know that one who over lifnei hateva, one who passes before the ark," that's the rabbinic idiom for leads the Amidah, how do we know that they should mention worship and then bow? Tzarich laskir avodah, that's our bracha, and then lashuach, and then to bow, which we do in modim. How do we know that that's the way it happens? Because of this bracha. And then they quote the bracha that as they are familiar with it, Ritzei Adonai Eloheinu, Ushchon b'Tzion irecha. Accept Adonai our God and dwell in Zion your city, which is the Eretz Yisrael version that we saw yesterday, which is not the same version that we recite today in all the different versions that are recited in modern worship. And then maybe this is the end of that bracha, although it's not in a lot of the manuscripts. Dwell in Zion your city as in days of old, and then speedily Yavducha avadecha u'Yerushalayim nishtachaveh lecha. May your servants worship you, and in Jerusalem may we bow down to you. That's where the bowing is coming from. But what you see here again is the old Eretz Yisrael version preserved in this midrash that is sort of like version 1 of our bracha. We're reciting version 2 in a post-exile, post-sacrifice version. And so what's important to remember about the bracha that we recite is that it's a bracha that's already been right-sized for the time that we live in. We're not reciting an anachronistic bracha having done sacrifice. Rather, our bracha that we recite has been updated in various ways. That's what we're going to have to explore as we make our way through it. Now, just in case you think this was like just an Eretz Yisrael tradition, what's striking about it is actually we have a tshuva from one of the leaders of Babylonian Jewry named Rav Natronai Gaon, who's living in the 9th century and running one of the yeshivas that is sort of the central factory for liturgy for the whole Jewish world, not just an old Eretz Yisrael tradition. And he's asked a question about various pieces of the Siddur, of the liturgy. And he says, well, concerning Avodah, they asked him, how do we say it? What's the bracha for Avodah? What's the bracha for this blessing in the Amidah. And then he says, well, in the yeshiva and in the house of our rabbi in Bava, and in all the places where there are sages, that is to say, everybody who's on this train of rabbinic Judaism, kach omrim, this is what they should say. Ritzei Adonai Eloheinu, ushchon b'tzion irecha, meira v'yavducha banecha b'Yerushalayim. Right? It's that old version that we saw in the Midrash, in which we're asking God to accept something that seems to be more current about a sacrifice that obviously we're not doing in the 9th century, but is at least calling upon that. So what we have here is a world in which the original bracha that we're looking at was a bracha standalone, separate from the Amidah, a bracha that was recited after you perform a sacrifice. And now the version that we have that we're going to dive into in the rest of the week is the sort of updated version where we're asking God to return to Zion. We're no longer focused on the sacrifice part so much, but that's sort of the origin of this bracha and sort of part of what we have to take in as we make our way to interpreting what we do actually say.